Today, we're going to talk about JKSS Piano Sonata No.5, which was written in the spring of 2021. That spring was not any ordinary spring season. Spring usually marks a revival of life, but in contrast to the spring the year before, when COVID brought the world to a standstill, the spring of 2021 presented the start of a hopeful passage of revival with effective vaccines and new norms. This sonata has elements of revisiting old memories with the excitement of what the future brings. The central theme of this sonata is adaptability and flexibility. This theme is explored through various usages of diminished seventh chords in the wide variety of settings. Diminished seventh chords on their own, here's an example, can sound very haunting. It is certainly used that way in the second movement. However, with different harmonic progression and melodic movement, it can also sound very affectionately. Here's a passage from the first movement. The diminished seventh chord is adaptable and flexible because the intervals between all of its chord notes are the same. They're all minor thirds, even between a top note and a bottom note. So inversions can be thought of as another diminished seventh chord built on a different root note. So here's one on F sharp. And one inversion up. It sounds the same, but you can think of it as a diminished seventh chord with the A as a root note. So let's look at the sonata in more details. The first movement is in E flat major, it is in sonata form, and it opens with great fanfare. But it's really made of a few simple harmonic progressions. It starts on E flat, then it goes to C minor, F minor, we have the 1-6-4, and 5-7, D flat, dominant 7, back to E flat. After the opening fanfare, we hear the first theme in E flat major. It greatly contrasts the fanfare. It has parallel melodic lines between the left and right hands, which is going to be a feature of the remainder of the sonata. And it is punctuated with quick hit chords. It almost has a feeling of a concerto where the single melodic line represents a solo instrument and the orchestra responds to those occasional chords. Then as a melodic line shift to the left hand, we have sustained chords in the right hand. It's almost like the orchestra took over the solo instrument with the melody in the bass instruments and the winds, providing the supporting chords. A surprising B natural hits and starts to shift the tonality. Eventually, we have dark clouds forming and we're in the dominant region, but it's in B flat minor for the second theme, as if it's telling us that not everything is smooth sailing. The second theme is expressive in a contained way. It has a controlled amount of movement and it emotes through pattern nature of the theme. Here's the pattern. So the second and the fourth. Remember the fanfare and the first theme? Well, suddenly they come back and they act as a bridge between the minor and major tonalities. So the big chords snap the music back into major from minor. Then we have the second theme again, but this time in B flat major, which gives us a much warmer and lusher sound. It's like telling us how we can prevail over the dark clouds and to see the sun shine through again. It built intensity by having patterns of overlapping melodies. So let's see what that means. So here's that pattern again, and it's going to overlap. Here it is again. And wouldn't you know it, the first theme rhythm comes back again, and the big chorus, this time proclaiming a majestic announcement to the end of the exposition section. Next, we have the development section, and it's supposed to be unstable. It explores the thematic materials of the sonata in various tonalities. So it starts with the opening fanfare, but in G flat major. Then we have a witty dominant 7, German 6 pivot, and that lands us into F major. So we hear some materials from the first theme, and it quickly changes into F minor, and with some modulation to C minor as well. We have some quick hit sections and the second theme in C minor, and all of these back and forth are like little debates between different voices. I'll give you an example of that. So the development section keeps exploring the materials in different tonalities. We hit the B flat minor, and before long, we come upon a cycle of perfect fifths. We have a repeated pattern, each one a fifth away from the previous one. And as the pattern goes on, the length of the piece of the pattern gets cut in half. This technique is called diminution. Shortening the thematic material creates a sense of urgency and tension, which is then resolved into the serene second theme in D major. D flat here goes to G flat, B major, E major, and now it's half the time. A, D. So we haven't talked about the diminished seventh chords yet. Actually, they have been scattered throughout the first movement already, but in the D major passage, we get a series of them in descending sequence that is also a quasi-quotation to another JKSS composition from 2010. This is clearly an example of revisiting old memories. Here's a part from the sonata. and compare it to the other composition, Ring Ring from 2010. It's the same diminished seventh chord progression. Suddenly, the fanfare comes back and it snaps us out of this revisiting old memories back to reality. The fanfare goes through chromatic harmonies and is used to transition out of the development back to the recap section. The recaps interestingly starts in C major, not the expected E flat, which is the tonality of the movement. Here we have this "Are you sure?" moment. It starts in C. As the first theme carries on, it subtly shifts back to E flat major and it goes into the second theme, which stays in E flat major. The second theme in the recap section is the same as that in the exposition, but just in the home key of E flat. At the end, when the fanfare comes back, it goes through a chromatic harmonic progression like the one we heard at the end of the development section, and it leads us into the coda, which wraps up the movement. In the coda, we first hear the first theme in G major, and then there's a cycle of perfect fifths. Again, that leads us to the big dominant chord hold. We have a slight pause there at the dominant chord, and then we hear the second theme in E flat major again, this time quietly and with the diminished seventh pattern that we heard in D major passage in the development section. You can think of this as concluding as a concluding thought after all the activity in the movement. The first movement then ends majestically and confidently with one more fanfare. Here's the ending. We move on to the slow second movement, which is in relative C minor and in ternary form, A, B, A. The mood generally goes between suspense, haunting, and melancholy, as if searching for the solution to what seems to be an unanswerable question. The A section starts with parallel melodic lines, just like the first theme in the first movement, but in canon, meaning the right hand starts first and then the left hand follows. But very quickly, at the end of the phrase, we hit the diminished seventh chords. Next, we have this wave of big sound, almost like it's washing everything away for another fresh start. We do get a fresh start, as we just heard, we landed on G minor here in the dominant region. After a short stay in G minor, we go back to the starting theme in C minor, but with a slightly different sequence of descending diminished 7th chords. That builds up intensity by landing on the diminished 7th chord and playing inversions of it while holding down the sustained pedal. We get this giant block of growing, haunting sound while the harmony changes in name with a different bass note, and it ultimately gets us back to the tonic region of C. We get a temporary relief from the melancholy when C major is heard at the end of the first A section. Here's the cadence in C major. And this leads us into the B section in C major. It is a sunnier spot of the movement full of belief of triumph with the assertive nature of the bells-like ringing followed by firm statements. That assertive nature of the B section would not last long before the tentativeness of the A section comes back. This time the A section theme is played quietly and in unison, adding to the suspense. But then it gets cut off with a loud crashing sound, like a strong rebuke. This idea swirls around different tonalities before the waves once again wash it all away. We hit the C major cadence yet again. This time it leads to the coda, with the E natural, that tierce de Picardy, starting to shine through. With resolution to C major, we seem to have found the reconciliation point of all the ideas presented in the movement. Finally, it closes with a serene C major arpeggio that spans almost the entire range of the piano. Again, it is over a sustained pedal, producing a slightly foggy scene. We don't know what answer was found, but we are at peace and ready to move on. After a somber second movement, the third movement comes through refreshingly light and uplifting, in a somewhat of a pastoral and peaceful feeling. The third movement has a blended structure. The bass structure is that of a minuet and trio, but has components of the sonata form. It is in G major, which at first may seem far away from E flat. However, G is only a major third up from E flat, and it is part of the E flat chord. Also, we have had many brushes with G previously in the coda of the first movement, and that's as dominant of the second movement's C tonality. So we say it's a blended structure because the minuet structure is generally ABA form with the minuet repeated. The third movement is really A-B-A-B with a coda. The A sections correspond to the minuet in G major, repeated exactly. The B section corresponds to the trio with the first theme in E flat and the second time in the home key of the movement G major. As you can see, there is still a strong connection to E flat major. We open once again with the parallel melodic lines idea, but the variation this time is that the left hand moves first while the right hand holds, and then the left hand holds, and then the right hand moves. Left hand moves, right hand holds, right hand moves, and left hand holds. This is the principal motif in the movement. As the minuet modulates to D major, the diminished seventh chords get their first feature in the lead up to the cadence. This is actually a condensed version of the sequence we heard in the first movement. Here's the first movement. And the third movement here. A generally peaceful movement still needs to have moments of tension to build up intensity and have contrast to truly bring out its peaceful nature. After the cadence in D major comes an extended passage where tension builds. This happens first with a quick pivot to move us to B flat major. Then it takes a minuet theme and it gradually shifts it up, the tonality going from B flat to C to D. Diminished sevenths here. And a return to the theme. So that takes us back to the minuet theme. And this time we resolve it through a diminished seventh sequence in G major to end the minuet. The trio section features a simple four-note motif over stepwise broken chords in the bass. That's a four-note motif. And if you look at it closely, the first four notes, E, A, F sharp, G. It's actually the minuet theme, but double the length of time for each note. The minuet theme was this. And in the trio, the second half of the trio features the inversion of this theme, so upside down. And here it goes. it continues into a coda, which wraps up this wonderful movement built on a short, tiny motif. Now we arrive at the monumental final movement. It is back in E flat and in sonata form. This movement is full of energy, passion, and is excited and ready to take on the world and all its challenges. The first theme is a fascinating combination of the fanfare and parallel melodic lines idea from the first movement. It features a chordal component like the fanfare. And it's followed by a parallel melodic line centered on the same chord. What makes this first theme fascinating is the chord progression. It mirrors that of the fanfare. So we have E flat, C minor here, F minor, B flat 7, dominant 7, resolving back to E flat. We have a transitional passage that brings us to the second theme, which is an uneven pulsing dotted rhythm. The theme is quite short on its own, but it develops by exploring various textures. At the beginning of the second theme in B flat major, the theme emerges in the left hand and has decorative accompaniment in the right hand. This texture is comparable to an orchestra with the brass instruments playing the theme and the winds providing the accompaniment. And then it shifts to a more flowing texture in the right hand compared with the string instruments. And we have a surprise. It shifts to D flat. Next comes an overlapping sequence of dotted rhythm. And then it overlaps with another one. And there's a diminished seventh chord here once again, as it keeps climbing through a series of secondary diminished seventh chords. The diminution technique is used once again to build up the intensity. As you can see that towards the end, the section gets to be half the length. The whole section is like a coiled spring being compressed until you let go and it bounces back with force by a powerful fireworks ending. That's like the whole orchestra playing together, tutti. The exposition section closes and leads into the development section using materials from the first theme. Here, the tonal relationship we have seen reappear. The development section starts in G major, very familiar, which is the tonality of the third movement, and then it follows a cycle of fifths through C and F majors. Suddenly, we have a shift in tonality from F major to F minor, and then a subtle change in intervals leads us into a sequence that lands us at C sharp diminished 7. And that sequence leads us into the second theme in D major. And again, the D major is that connectiveness again with the third movement and also with the first movement passage. So the development section starts in G. C sharp diminished 7. And it will lead into a D major passage. The D major passage evolves through a varied overlapping sequence of dotted rhythm, and it lands us at an A flat minor chord. At this point, we reached a subliminal moment where everything seems to be frozen in place, as if there were doubts as to how we can make future memories as good as the past ones. A flat minor. However, this moment will be short-lived, as this passage slips through a cycle of fifths. A quick chromatic descent lands us on B flat chords, and then you can feel the sense of energy and passion return with the re-entrance of the first theme in E flat major. This marks the end of the development section and the beginning of the recap. So here's a A flat passage, bringing us back to the recap. The recap section is very similar to the exposition section, but with the second theme in the home key of E flat major. The higher registers heighten the intensity and resolution of the overlapping dotted rhythm sequence. Here's the second theme starting from the overlapping sequence to the end of the recap section, which ends on a 1-6-4 chord, asking a question of what does this all mean and where do we go from here? So we'll play the second theme. The 1-6-4 chord here. The following coda answers those questions with an emphatic call to charge forward with fortitude. The tempo picks up immediately when the coda begins, and it plays the parallel melodic lines from the first theme in an assertive manner in E flat. And suddenly, the tempo slows and we hear the overlapping dotted rhythm sequence again. This is the final use of the diminished seventh chords to build up to the final fanfare. The tempo gradually increases, and when the sequence soars through the high registers and resolves in E flat, we welcome the final fanfare featuring the first theme. We're almost in double tempo now as we excitedly race towards the finish. I've listened to the end of the recap section and how the coda plays out.